Hello and welcome to the next episode of The Prestige, a podcast about films, filmmaking and film theory.
In each programme we'll focus on a particular movie, we're going to review it, talk about it, and some of the ideas and themes that it throws up from our viewing.
And as always, we'll end with our recommendations for films to watch following this week's film. The links can be close or as tenuous as we feel.
But before we get into that, who are we and why should you care what we think? Well, my colleague on the podcast is Sam Knowles. He is a published author and lecturer on all things to do with words and stories. He's written about books and movies and comic books and graphic novels and sport for quite a while on one podcast, on one blog. Basically, he is the smart one in the room, bringing the culture. I, on the other hand, am bringing the technical knowledge. I spent the last 10 years working in the British film industry, working on all sorts of productions from little and no budget horror films no one's ever heard of, all the way up to Oscar-winning Hollywood productions. These days I ply my trade as a photographer and a reviewer of films here and on various websites.
Great. So this week, Rob, it was your turn.
It was. And my choice for this week was the 2012 film Beasts of the Southern Wild. Now don't worry if you haven't heard of this film, it wasn't a massively well-known film. It did get nominated for 4 Oscars in its time, but it wasn't like a box office smash, shall we say. It's from first-time director Ben Zeitlin, first-time writer Lucy Alibar, starring 2 first-time actors who are called Dwight Henry and Kwavenjani Wallace. I've been practicing that name, if you haven't guessed. And it tells the story of Hush Puppy. Hush Puppy is a 6-year-old girl living in something called the Bathtub, which is a Bayou community near Orleans, and it's extreme poverty of their lives, but at the same time it's intermixed with this fantastical, surreal images and stories they tell each other. They have their own language, their own traditions, their own world, and it's very contemplative and almost non-narrative, the film is. Well, it does have a narrative to it. So that's probably the best kind of coverage I can give in it before I start getting into the area of spoilers. Sam,
yes,
your thoughts?
I really, really like this film.
Good.
I said last week that this was one that I was annoyed at having missed at the time. So I was pleased that we'd got to watch it for this podcast. And I really like it. I've talked before about my liking for films and books and lots of other things in which not a lot happens, but it's very beautifully written or shot or edited. And I like the way that everything fits together about this film, and it's a very circular film, not in a cliched way, in that sort of there are the same lines at the end as there are at the beginning, sort of thing, necessarily, but there is a circularity about Hush Puppy's view of reality in the bathtub, and it's very pleasing. Also, I felt this film was a particularly faithful rendition of childhood, of the attitude of a child to the world around her or him. In this case, Hush Puppy is female, but this idea of gender is something we'll talk about later. But her father, Wink, is very he's very gender neutral in the way that he behaves towards Hush Puppy and the language he uses to her. So this is not necessarily a vision of a little girl's view of the world so much as a small person's view of the world, and I think it was all the better for that. I like the way the sound. I often pick up on the sound in films, the music that's used in films, and the the way that heartbeats are used throughout this film. Even right at the very beginning, I enjoy the way that what Hush Puppy hears is what we hear with the sound of the pig's heartbeat at the beginning. There was some useful in terms of thinking about juxtaposition of poverty and the riches that you see when you look over the levee, in that sort of establishing shot, and you get Wink's voiceover, and he speaks to Hush Puppy about wouldn't it be awful to live here or live there or words to that effect. When he's looking over at the city, he calls it the ugly city, and I like that. I also like how there was a lot from Hush Puppy about at the beginning about how happy she was, and poverty didn't matter, and squalid conditions, what would be called squalid conditions, didn't matter because she had free range food, and they were free range children. That's something that she says. I won't say in so many words, but she makes it clear at the very beginning about how it's good that kids can run around and have fun rather than being put in cages at the beginning of their lives. And I liked all that, how she suffers in certain ways throughout the film, and she gets particularly sad at certain points, and the relationship with her father brings that out. But her worldview is not necessarily disrupted by the end. She still sees the bathtub as the place to be. Hush Puppy presents the symbiosis, the relationship between man and nature.
I would echo almost everything of what you said there. I mean, I probably picked it. I first saw this film when it first came out and was really kind of... I wouldn't say I was blown away by it, but I was certainly intrigued by it, and it was certainly a filmic experience, which I've talked about on this. It isn't about a narrative or a character's arc, it's about experience, a visual one. I think that visually, which is where a lot of my passion for films comes from, it was very interesting. There was lots of what you'd almost term non-hero shots, kind of the wandering camera capturing bits of this world, and great work was done to set up kind of the mise en scène of the world and the life that Hush Puppy and Wink live. From my point of view of the film, I very much kind of take it as Hush Puppy is telling the story that we see. So everything is told from her point of view. So there's a running theme through the film of these giant prehistoric boars coming back to reclaim the land, and it leads to a very powerful moment later on. But that to me very much felt like the story a parent tells their kids about the wind, about the weather, and lots of things in this film felt like we were seeing the literal child's interpretation of what their parents say, and everything felt like this is what the child is seeing. And I think that it's very hard to see this film without bringing Hurricane Katrina into it a little bit. It deals with Orleans and levees breaking and weather and flooding, and there's a lot of that about it. Obviously, these guys live outside the levees and are kind of impacted worse by the impacts of the storm or the boars as it's portrayed in the film. I thought visually it was amazing, kind of the mixture of, as I said, the reality and the surreality. I genuinely can't work out if this is a strength or weakness of the film. It feels very allegorical, but isn't clear on what its allegory is. It's purposely ambiguous on what that second story is, because it leaves you thinking, what is that about? And there's things that, as I said, looking at Katrina, and there's things you're like, well, is it a meditation on Katrina? Is it about Katrina? Is it about childhood? Is it about this? Is it about that? And I think that it feels purposeful where someone gets their eyes sliced open, but the rest of the film it is completely non-linear, non-narrative, And people at the time were outcrying that he was talking about child abuse in the church. He was talking about feminism, and people are like, "Well," he's like, "Well, no, that's what you're seeing in it, and that's what you're seeing because of you rather than because of the film." And this felt very similar. That any kind of allegory that I was going to put on this film was one I was bringing with me,
right?
Rather than one that the film was giving me.
I didn't see any of that to do with the storm, and I saw that the film and the circular structure and the way it was edited was itself a metaphor for what it's like to be a child, missing things and reading things in a certain way and having a very pure attitude to the world around you, pure in the sense of not sullied by other things, by other interpretations, sort of naive and childlike. Not childish, but childlike attitude to the world. And it's interesting that and actually there was I think it was an IMDb review of it or some other synopsis of it somewhere that said that Wink's illness.
And there's a great bit, I think, where Wink is telling the story of when he met the mother. And he says, we always get lazy. We'd always be lazy and we kind of lie in the sun. And one day I was so lazy I fell asleep. And he clearly doesn't mean lazy.
Yeah.
He's clearly talking about, I imagine, drunk or high or something like that. But there's all these things where you're like, that's clearly him just saying. And one of the notable things early on is that they have two houses. You have Wink's house and Hushpuppy's house. And for me, when thinking about childhood, I kind of thought back to growing up as a child myself, that there was my house that I grew up in, but at a certain point now I look back and there's also my parents' house. It was the same physical location, but there's this kind of separation of what's theirs and what's mine, and this idea that as a kid and a parent you have different houses. Obviously in the real world they are one place, but there are different experiences of that house, and that was repeated here in those two buildings they separated.
Yes, yeah. It's another thing about that separation of the houses is you get a glimpse of how selfish a 6-year-old child is, and that's not a value judgment. That's just a statement of fact. Children are selfish in the very real sense of things being about themselves, because that's something you learn as you get older. You learn the perspective of other people, and that's something we're saying about this film, the presentation of this film. But Hushpuppy is she's very wrapped up in herself, and she doesn't. And you come to understand later that there was only really one house. The only decent house, structurally, was Hushpuppy's, and the father was living in a shack made up of the boat and then some tarpaulins and scaffolding, and it's basically he's living in the shelter and she is living in the house, but she doesn't see that. She sees that she's got a separate dwelling, and she thinks, well, this is mine to do with as I see fit. You know what? I'm going to burn it down because I'm angry at my dad. And you think later, well, there was something very self-involved about that, and there's that scene where she's brought back into the father's house, and we come to realise that he was being very selfless in giving her this house, and there's something very, very loving about the way he treats her, in that he will be angry at her for everyday things, but for the real big things that you could be really angry about someone for a long time, like burning down a house. It's just like, well, that's the way it is. She's going to be a kid. Okay, I will be angry. I'm going to be angry at her briefly because I've lost her and I'm scared for her in this inferno. But ultimately, whatever. It's a house. It's fixable. It's property. Property doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is this person. Well,
I think I would agree with that. I think that one thing that struck me at the end of the film is that the very much the film is kind of about Hush Puppy's growth into some sort of pseudo adulthood. At the start of the film, there's a lot about we talk about things being broken.
Yes.
And there's a lot of destruction in the film of people, of relationships, of physical items. And at the start of the film, it's often said by Hush Puppy that if it's broken, it can be fixed, and that's the end goal, is to fix everything, and everything's happy again because it's fixed. And if anything is broken, it can be fixed back to how it was. Whereas the end of the film, you feel very much that she's come to terms with the fact that sometimes you can't put everything back in its place. You can't put everything back as it was.
And
some things can't be fixed.
It doesn't matter. That's
yes.
what you get to at the end. It's her realisation that not everything can be fixed, but you know what? That's life. And yes. I understand that.
And you understand the journey, and it isn't like the idolisation of this one part of her life, this one snapshot of her life that, you know, that she's in love with, and the idea of her mum coming back and all that kind of thing. She's sort of hanging on to this idea of things will go back to how they were. And by the end, you feel that she's gone through that childhood journey that we all go through to the point, you know what, that isn't coming back. Things are going to change, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better, but you've got to keep going with it. And I think that along with that, the film very much starts off as the adults and Hush Puppy. And Hush Puppy and her dad, a little unit. So she feels sort of separate from a lot of the world. Whereas at the end, without giving spoilers away, the last shot of the film is very much she is part of that community. She is part of the wider world. She stepped away from the shadow of being a daughter and a child into being, I suppose, a larger part of the larger world. In this case, the bathtub. But I think that if that to me, this I felt like it being a bit like it was the journey she was going on, was that journey into adulthood, in the way this film kind of handles it, in the kind of mumblecore, wandering camera, surrealist way. And there's a moment with the Aurochs, where there's a confrontation between her and them, and that to me felt like the moment in which you faced up to the real world. Or faced up to impending adulthood, or the idea that of selflessness, possibly.
I felt as well that you're right. There is something. The film is doing something with that moment with the Aurochs, or whatever the plural of Aurochs is. But also you have that moment with the chef in Elysian Fields, the club that the boat takes her to towards the end, and you very much had a realisation that goes on in Hush Puppy's mind that, oh right, I understand my place in the world, and I understand what I've got to go and do and who I've got to go and be with now. So it felt that this sort of moment with the Aurochs didn't really matter, because that moment of realisation had already happened. That crisis point in her head had already come to pass.
Yeah, I think that the moment with the Aurochs was the manifestation of that call to action.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
That she made the choice, made the realisation there, then with the rest of the girls came back to the bathtub and then put that realisation into action with that confrontation.
Something else I wanted to talk about is the way that she views it, and this might be going back a little to her perspective before that realisation, but she views humans as animals, and it's something you get several times, and it's actually not just her. You get it with the father telling her to beast it, which is his way of saying she should be consuming food in a certain way. But it's also something you get in Hush Puppy's language. She describes sort of a holding cell in a hospital as looking like a fish tank with no water.
Yes.
And she says when an animal gets sick, and she is talking about humans, because there's an injured person in shock when she says that. But and I don't know whether that this is something that she grows out of. I'm not sure about that, but she very definitely sees humans as just another animal.
Mm. I think, through the early scenes, certainly, you get very much the feeling that she has this deep connection to the earth. She's very much feels like a child of the ground that she's from. There's interactions with the birds and the and normal sized boars and that kind of stuff. And early on in the film, you get the feeling that very much she sees herself and lives her life as part of the environment she's in.
Mm.
And once again, going back to the allegory of, I don't know what they're trying to say, but the early scenes are very much, they're in an overgrown woodland. There aren't any kind of roads. It's just kind of higgledy-piggledy kind of land. The very last shot is them walking clearly down a road. And that, to me, once again, felt important, but I wasn't sure what for. Because I didn't want to think they were kind of stepping away from that childhood fantasy life you're living beforehand. But maybe that's it. Maybe they're trying to sort of say she lived in this fantasy bubble as a kid, and now she's come to terms with the fact that that isn't always the case.
Mm. Also, to back up this idea of it's sort of a vagueness about what this is about, the title of the film, and I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure what it refers to, the beasts of the southern wild, and whether it's talking about. It could be talking about three things. It could be talking about the aurochses you get, these medieval creatures, or it could be talking about the humans, this relationship between the animal and the human, or it could very literally be talking about the animals around them, and you have the animals they keep domestically, or the wild animals, so the alligator, and that turns into food later on, And I wasn't sure what this phrase "beasts of the southern wild" was talking about, and I quite liked the fact that I didn't know. That was there was something quite comforting for me about this. That would be from what is a very traumatic and by no means an easy film to watch. It was nevertheless comforting, and that would be my response to this film in general, if I had to describe it in one word.
So, Sam, having watched the film, what are your recommendations for further reading this week?
Right. Well, I have two recommendations. One of them is not a film, but we've done this before. So after finishing The Wire, David Simon moved on to post Hurricane Katrina New Orleans with the TV series Treme.
Treme, I believe it's pronounced.
Oh, fine, I don't know.
I believe.
All right. I'm just gonna. I'll just carry on saying Convention Wallace then.
Sure.
So Treme, fine, okay. David Simon, Treme, and there are some very interesting things this series has to say about the relationship between humans and nature, and humans and other humans, and there are some. Well, it has interesting things to say about the racial. Well, that was interesting. Racial relationship. I've just invented a new word. The racial relationships that get thrown into relief by the event of Hurricane Katrina, and that's something I think also is being discussed in this film, however obliquely. And my second one would be, I think, possibly from the same year as the beginning of Treme, Where the Wild Things Are from 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And this came to mind actually as you were speaking about this sort of relationship between a child's perspective and the way it was presented on screen. Something very fantastical, but also very moving about Where the Wild Things Are, as well as this film. So that would be my other recommendation for this week, because that's a brilliant film. You should go out and watch that.
Excellent. I'm going to bring my tea this week, and for once we haven't overlapped, which is good. So my first recommendation is, I'll start with the more tenuous one first of all, and it's a film called Stand By Me. Now, this is quite a well-known film. It's from 1986. It tells the story of four friends who go on not a road trip, but a walking trip to see a dead body. And it's all about them bonding and coming to terms with mortality and coming to terms with the idea that this snapshot of their lives isn't going to exist forever. And it stars the sort of tragic figure of River Phoenix, but also Will Wheaton, Corey Feldman, Jerry Connell? Jerry Connell's the four friends. But it's very much handles the same sort of ground of coming to terms with the death of innocence, coming to terms with standing up for yourself, and the idea of impending adulthood, and what that all means. I really, really like it, and I would recommend it heartily for anyone who looking to that kind of particularly. And I don't ever want to kind of feature sort of gendered recommendations, but very much about growing up a boy and into becoming a man. I think this film is about that. Secondly, and much more visually and thematically similar, is The Tree of Life from 2011. It's like the year before Beasts of the Wild. It's a Terrence Malick film, and it very much has a similar sort of visual vibe of beautiful drifting shots of nothing and everything at the same time, oblique allegory. If you can skip past the really quite dodgy dinosaur scenes, it is a beautiful and wonderful film.
Right.
Which is a phrase I never thought I'd say, but it's wonderful film that kind of covers the life of a family when the loss of the innocence of a child and how that child grows up to deal with that. And it's wonderful, but it has a weird decision choice to have a scene with some dinosaurs in it, and it really kind of kills a lot of the film that scene does. So it suffers because of that, but the other bits of that film are probably one of the best looking films I've seen in a long time. It's once again, it's not a film where you'll sit down and get a rip-roaring adventure, a narrative journey. It is contemplative, it is slow, but it is worth checking out. It's over 2 hours long, but it's worth checking out.
Right then, next week.
Yes, Sam.
Right. I have two films in mind. Now, I'm not going to spoil things for you, Rob, by telling you what they are, but I would like you to pick one of them. One of them's from 2009 and one's from 2013. So I will
go from the one from 13.
Right. Okay. Then next week we'll be looking at a film which is close to Rob's heart, and will no doubt offer him a multitude of opportunities for name dropping. It is one of the last films he worked on. I believe it is 2013's World War Z.
World War Z. All right. Fair enough. Brad Pitt zombie film. Let's do it.
Right.
So, guys, if you want to check us out online, you can find both of us at Prestige Podcast on Twitter.
Or you can find me at life_academic.
Or you can find me at Rob Kaiju. Come argue about films with us. Come tell us what you watch. Come tell us how we're wrong.
Mainly Rob.
Yes, mainly me. And we'll see you guys next week.
Oh, and by the way, don't forget to like us, recommend us, do your thing on iTunes or SoundCloud. It's very much appreciated.
It very much is.
See you next week.
Bye.
The Prestige is a Kaiju Industries production. Check out their other work at facebook.com/Kaiju Industries. Rawr! Arg.